would like to introduce Dr. Wendy Waszut-Barrett. And Wendy says that she is fully capable of introducing herself, which is great because I can't. So, Wendy, turn on your mic, turn on your video, and I will disappear. And
okay. Well, that
let's
made me
go.
sound a little snarky, and that was not my intent. It's just part of my presentation. So I'm going to start right away. I'm going to share my screen. If you can see it, and I have subtitles on, so those of you with hard of hearing can adequately follow. So I'm going to talk tonight about Scottish Rite scenery, how it's produced, some of the care that needs to be taken when handling and trying to restore it. But I'm going to give a brief introduction of myself first, just so you can understand the perspective from which I'm speaking. So I am the founder and president of Historic Stage Services. My company specializes everything behind the curtain line. So historic scenery, staging, lighting system, and stage machinery. I work as a historical consultant in North America and Europe. I'm a scenery restoration specialist, meaning I know how to clean and take care of and replicate historic scenes. I still work as a contemporary designer and have two operas that open, one in Chicago and one in Baton Rouge, Louisiana this summer. I work as a fine artist and a scenic artist, and I'm also an author, meaning I write a blog daily, but I'm also published and write articles about both theater history and Scottish Rite. To give you a sense of some of the current projects that I'm working on, I've recently removed two 64-foot murals, which I will be restoring from Okanagan, Washington State, that were discovered in January and featured on CNN. They busted through a wall and found two murals from 1914. I'm currently working with the Tabor Opera House in Leadville, Colorado, where I was able to identify a couple hundred pieces of scenery, many of which had been stored in the attic, dating from 1879 to 1902. I'm currently the historical consultant in Kortrijk, Belgium, working with their municipal theater and the collection that was cataloged by Bruno Formant in 2014 by Albert Dubosc. And 5 of the scenes have been identified as Flemish national treasures. So I'm working with conservators in regards to appropriate handling and restoration techniques. But what this all brings back to is when I was an undergraduate in college and going to theater in a sense, going to college for a degree in theater, I was given the task of creating an index for Thomas Moses's diary and scrapbook. And Thomas Gibbs Moses, 1856 to 1934, he supervised a lot of Scottish Rite scenery production produced at Sauceman and Landis for the Southern jurisdiction. So he personally supervised the design, painting, and installation of 51 Scottish Rites across the country, 14 shrines, 9 grottos, and there's a series that goes on. It's not that he specialized in fraternal scenery, it's that made up about a quarter of the orders that Sauceman and Landis received in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Also, while I was given this task as an undergraduate, I started to catalog 2 Masonic collections that came into the University of Minnesota. One was the Great Western Stage Equipment Company, and those were designs primarily created by Don Carlos Du Bois, and he's the artist that's credited with the scenery that is currently installed at the Omaha Scottish Rite that came out of Kansas City, Kansas. I also cataloged and documented and put into a database the Hollick collection. So these 2 Masonic collections, some of which had historic theater, were basically added into a digital database that's still accessible. And in 1999 to 2000, I was able to assign the metadata. So I'm extremely familiar with various Scottish Rite degrees for both Northern and Southern jurisdiction. And then I had the great fortune of, while I was cataloging collections and while I was getting an BA, MA, and PhD at the University of Minnesota, I was also restoring Scottish Rite scenery. So I could go from basically the design to the scenery that was painted from it. One of the collections that I was able to restore was the Santa Fe Scottish Rite collection. To give you a sense of scope, this is a 1912 collection by Sossman and Landis. And then I had the privilege of being the volume editor for the Santa Fe Scottish Rite book. I was a contributing editor along with state historian Rick Hendricks, Kristan Villela, who's out of the International Folk Art Museum. He's the director, and Joe Whaley, who's an internationally recognized photographer. And then what I realized after I had completed my PhD, and what my topic is the integration of theatrical scenery into Masonic ritual, especially Scottish Rite ritual. And I traced that history, but then took the 18th degree to use as an example to show how it shifted from the rite of perfection when it came over through the West Indies, and how that was transitioned to the stage, going from tracing cloths to magic lantern slides to other murals and then scenery. So I started to realize I had all this knowledge from couple decades, 3+, that was tapped in my head, and thought that no one had access to that, and decided to leave a trail of breadcrumbs and create my own database. So instead of looking for funding or going to any entity, I just started a blog, but I made it a searchable blog so that as I would add information, people would be able to access it from across the country. And then I paste the same information sometimes, not all the time, to my Facebook group, which is Dry Pigment. And it's the idea of having an international dialogue and discussion about scenery. I also work as a fine artist. Here are some examples of my acrylic paintings. All of them are ranging about 8x12 to 16x20. I teach fine art, especially to children. So I'm well-versed in graphite, pastels, oils, acrylics, you name it, that's what I do. However, that's very different from scenic art for the stage. I was trained as a scenic artist. Here's an example of a 12x18-foot drop that I painted for the University of Minnesota Centennial Showboat about a decade ago. I use a traditional method with pounces and coloration and traditional painting techniques from the early 20th century and the centuries before. And I work currently with colleagues in Europe because Chris van Gutem in Brussels is studying light as it works with dry pigment. So I have been bringing over, when I visit, small 1 meter by 2 meter dry pigment drops and color swatches so that he has something to use. The important thing, I'm going to talk you through how the Omaha Scottish Rite scenery is created, how the Hastings Scottish Rite scenery is created, and talk you through the dry pigment paint system, because it is as different from contemporary scenic art for the stage as it would be from an oil painting or fresco. So what makes all of the scenery work so well is that there is a careful combination of colors. And it's not like popping open a can of blue and popping open a can of orange. And those pure colors, so if you imagine powdered sugar that's colored, that's what I'm talking about from a dry pigment standpoint. When you mix those colors together, it helps reflect light, unlike traditional painting. And what it's called is distemper painting, where you have a pigment paste and you have size water, which is basically glue water. So it starts out dry. This is not the palette that a scenic artist would use, but it shows you the example of the dry colors and the dry glue that would be shipped to the studio in the 19th and early 20th century. Sometimes the color would come in blocks, and that block would need to be ground down to a fine powder, because you can't have not a fine powder if you have granules that stick to the paint, that causes a whole series of problems later on. The powder is transformed into a paste. And so you can see this is the same paint, it's just one is wet and one is dry. What is amazing about dry pigment is it dries true to color. So when you get it wet, you basically paint blind, because you'll be putting this dark green up, but it's going to dry this incredibly light green. And here's an example of a wet color and dry color next to each other. to give you a sense. It's incredibly difficult. You can't be an artist and understand color and suddenly start working with dry pigment. It takes decades to figure out what you're doing. And I'm finally there, but it, it took decades. This is a standard dry pigment palette that was used at Sossman and Landis from about 1906 until 1920, just so you can see the standard colors that were being used. You'll notice there was only one green, because typically you would not use green for foliage. That would be for like a green wall. You would want a combination of a warm and a cool color. So each color has a warm and cool version. Yellow, for example, would have a warm and a cool version. Blue would have a warm and a cool version. And it's the combination of those two that help the lights transition the painting from a daytime to a nighttime scene. This is what the standard palettes that scenic artists use. You can see it's like a traditional art palette, but huge. The tables typically measured 3 to 4 feet deep by about 6 to 8 feet wide, and they could often roll. The glue that is used, so if you took that pure color we've been looking at and just put it on fabric, it would all dust off. What makes it stick is glue water, and the type of glue that was used was a hide or a hoof glue. So depending on what your budget was, if you had a lot of money, you could use rabbit skin glue. If you didn't have a lot of money, it would be like bovine hides, and there's a combination thereof. But to give you a sense, upper right corner is the dry version of the glue. You let it blossom in water, cook it, and then start to thin it down to be size water. And delivering a visual aesthetic. So to place Scottish Rite scenery within the context of American history and theater history, you have to understand how it was created, because these were traditions that came over from both England and Europe with the immigrant artists that came over and really shaped the American art approach to stage art. So there are two ways to paint scenery. In England, it was very popular during the 19th century to paint up. That's what you see on the left. It's frame painting. On the right is painting in the continental method, which is down. I was trained in both ways. I learned to paint in the traditional method, painting up, and also with a bamboo stick, painting down. So Central Europe and the European countries, they were more tied into the floor painting tradition. So like at the Paris Opera or in Rome, it would be painting down. That's not meant to say they didn't ever paint up. They did, but the way that the European theaters were set up, there was more floor space. As it came over to America, the European painters started to shift doing more up, because that's how our paint frames were constructed, and we followed more of an English model. This gives you an example from 1878, and the illustration was actually done by a scenic artist, so we know it's fairly accurate. Charles Graham not only was an illustrator for Harper's Magazine, but he was also a painter in different studios in Chicago and New York. So you can see a paint bridge. So imagine 40 feet up above the stage floor, and you have painting on either side. And what's happening is, if you look down below, you can see a performance or rehearsal going on. So they're really high up, and there are stories about actors crisscrossing on the stage and accidentally knocking over pots of paint. As we started to take a more capitalist approach in America, theater was funded more by money versus court and state theaters. So it became more of a streamlined process. By the 1850s, the scenic studios started, and they would be positioned in a metropolitan area somewhere near a railroad hub, so that it could be painted on site and shipped, almost like mail order scenery. That didn't mean that they stopped painting at theaters, but this became more popular. And this shop was built in 1886 on South Clinton Street in Chicago. And here's the image. It was the Sossman and Landis studios from 1910. This is where the original Omaha scenery was painted before you replaced it with the Great Western Stage Equipment Company scenery. So delivering a visual aesthetic. If you think of the scenic artists, they were not just painting a design that someone handed them. They were actually masters of scenic illusion. So they fully understand the lighting systems that were in place that would light the painting. They understood all of the stage mechanisms that would move the scenery. It was much more than a scenic artist is handed a painting and I'm going to paint it. They understood and were masters of the backstage area. Some of them belonged to theater mechanics associations. Others were considered stage carpenters, and they delivered scenery to many different venues. For example, here's the convention hall in Kansas City. So scenic artists who also painted backgrounds for auto shows, in addition to live theater and early film. And they were also providing amusements for the Luna parks that went all over the country. Yes, the one in Coney Island, but the ones that were in Pittsburgh and elsewhere. And also the Grand Circus spectacles. So if you think they take the King Solomon story, and it's not only for the Freemasons, but it's for public theater too, and it's for Grand Circus spectacles. So Solomon and the Queen that Al Ringling produced using Thomas Moses's designs through the Sossman and Landis shops, that's now involving thousands of people under the big top. And then they're turning around and painting floor cloths too, or backgrounds for various Scottish Rite ballets. So when you think about Scottish Rite scenery, it's what's left of American history, a popular culture, like a material that is still left. Whereas in theater, it just kind of was ephemeral and went away. And for Scottish Rites, they became all these little time capsules that preserved this little snapshot in time that really isn't anywhere else because it's so complete. And then there was an aesthetic shift, except at the Scottish Rite. So up until about World War I, about 1914, even as film is starting to become more and more popular, there is still a romantic realism that is an approach. So you want scenic illusion on stage. You want to transport not only audience members, but Scottish Rite Masons and Oddfellows and Knights of Pythias and all of the different fraternal organizations that are using scenery for degree work. You're transporting them to another world. Because of the war and the draft, it meant that a lot of those journeyman artists, because it was a huge draft as far as who was part of the draft. I want to say it's like 21 to 40 something, but a lot of those people never returned to the industry. Some were killed. Some started to work in the governmental sector because scenic artists were responsible for camouflage in all of the different divisions, especially in the United States. And after the war, this, which is on your left, the romantic realism, starts to get replaced with this, which is on your right, for live performance. So academic theaters start to go more toward drapery and dimensional elements. And there's more of an abstract feel that starts to happen on stage. There's a little bit of a resurgence of romantic realism by the 40s and 50s with musicals, but it takes a very different perspective, and the scenic art world is split in two because you have abstract live performance, and this type of theater requires a whole different skill set than romantic realism. Romantic realism takes decades in art studies and still lifes. This takes understanding color, how to mix paint, and how to work a stencil or hold a line. So supply and demand. When the Scottish Rite started adding in scenery, there was a greater demand than supply. So scenic artists were making about $250,000. If you were good, you could work throughout the entire year and made just a ton of money. After World War I, there's more supply than demand because it's no longer painted scenery. It's really starting to go toward draperies and lighting systems and projections and different abstractions of what could be used on the stage. So a lot of the scenic studios started to focus more on academic installations and draperies and hardware. What kept scenic painting alive, other than in Hollywood, where a lot of those really high-end painters went and tightened their style for the lens of the camera, the Scottish Rite offered the opportunity for scenic artists to still deliver scenic illusion for the stage. So the Scottish Rite, whether it was delivered in 1910, 1920, 30, 40, 50, 60, it kept the same illusion. The color palette shifts, as do the lighting systems, but that's one of the things that goes on. So to walk you through Scottish Rite scenery, here's the Santa Fe Scottish Rite. It's 1912, came out of Sossman and Landis, basically the firm in the Northern Masonic jurisdiction that delivered almost all of the Southern jurisdiction scenery. Vice versa, St. Louis does the majority of Northern Masonic jurisdiction. My theory is it was easier marketing to a different jurisdiction because no one thought you were going to deliver something for free by just being a member. But when you look at Omaha, what was delivered to Santa Fe would have been what was first installed in your theater. Here's 1914, same year, the Humphrey Center, which was the Milwaukee Scottish Rite and is now in private ownership. To look at the color palette, this is very romantic realism versus what you have from Don Carlos Du Bois, which is now part of your collection. And it's not that one is better than the other, but you can tell there is an entirely different color palette and approach to scenic illusion on the stage. Now, what makes Omaha so special, and I will get to Hastings too, is that there is a track record with Omaha. There is an artistic provenance that is just stellar. So on the right is the drop that you have, my left and right. On the left is the drop that you have. On the right is the actual design that was created and that went off. So you can see the similarities, but you can tell how that composition was stretched based on the proscenium opening at Kansas City, Kansas, where the scenery was originally delivered. Again, here's the design by Don Carlos Du Bois. And this is Don Carlos Du Bois' family, because he did not start out as Du Bois. He started out as Bois and tried to pass him off as French for a while as he went from Omaha to Kansas City, and then founded his own studios in Atlanta and had the Atlanta Scenic Studios before he returned to Kansas City. And before he started illustrating bomber parts. So he did go back to the scenic art business, and he is solely responsible for a lot of the Scottish Rite collections that hit that second livelihood in a sense. So when the scenery was produced by Du Bois for Kansas City, he was also producing scenery for Galveston and Columbus, Georgia, and Atlanta, Georgia, and it goes all across the country because Kansas City Scenic was going to various places and remarketing it. And most of it was being solely painted by Don Carlos Du Bois, which is special in itself because when it went through a big scenic studio, there could be many hands on it. Hands that you can track down, internationally famous artists that you can track down to a specific scene. But Du Bois was doing entire collections by himself or with an assistant. But so you have the original designs, which are at the University of Minnesota Performing Arts Archives. So I know the Omaha scenery so well because that was the very first collection that I processed in 1989. And what was part of that collection, the designs, the renderings, there's a front and here's a back showing the stamp and what degree it's for and everything. That's digitized, as are the sketches and rough drafts, installation photos, catalogs are there. Don Carlos Du Bois, his cheat sheet, this is the one for Omaha as far as who to connect with, a lot of the contracts, keeping track of his hours. So there's no question about how much time and how much energy and who is being marketed to for your collection. So you purchased a very good collection. I'm very sad that Omaha got rid of the previous collection, but what you have is quite remarkable and needs to be preserved because it has artistic provenance. The only thing it's missing is the actual building that it was delivered to. So for example, because he also painted for Kansas City, Missouri, you can see from his rough sketch to the completed piece, the entire artistic process. So to know where the scenery for Omaha was painted, and I know this is heavy Omaha, but it hits home a little bit easier before we transition to the second studio. Here's an example of where the scenery was painted. There's the display room where all of the set pieces were constructed. where all of the draperies were done. The building was featured where the scenery went to in Kansas City, Kansas. They featured high-end auditoriums as part of their marketing. So this was just in the general public's brochure. But we have the pencil sketches that Du Bois did, photographs of when it was being painted on the frame. This is what's at the Omaha Scottish Rite, just so you can familiarize yourself with it. And the painted details. What makes much of Don Carlos, all of his stuff is scenic artists were never supposed to sign their work. And he did. And there's a record of the Valleys and the studio going back saying, hey, you know, one, for the catacombs, please don't put the names of people we can identify who are still alive or yourself. So there's a little bit of a pushback of you really don't do that and don't sign all over the place. So he got quite creative with how his signature got into almost all of the pieces. Here was his little scarab from 1952. But again, it's an artistic signature, so there's no question. And now it becomes a large scale artwork that's different than a large scale painting, but it still has the same provenance. And then again, going back to the drop to contrast it with Hastings. So here's a detail, and you can see how the color palette shifted. This is Hastings. It's a different studio. This was Bolland, which started as Bolland and Toomey. And you can get a sense. So from 1929, I believe, is when Bolland delivered to Hastings. There's a different approach to it. They had been doing Scottish Rite scenery for a very long time. P.J. Toomey was a well-known scenic artist in St. Louis and did several Mystic Prophet floats. He was known as the float man, but he was also an exquisite scene painter and had partnered with multiple fine artists who worked as scenic artists in the Midwest. He also partnered with Noxon and Toomey. So Noxon was the previous partner before Bolland. So Bolland worked up in the studio, had first started as a secretary, worked as a painter, but he was the one that connected Toomey with the Scottish Rite and the Scottish Rite in St. Louis, because that's where he was a member. And you can see, as of this point, I want to say this is from 1908. They really became big about 1902 when St. Louis had the very big stage before the massive stage of 1923. So when you look at the left, this is still Toomey and Bolland, and the founders of this company died within a year of each other. It's incredibly sad, and it passed to the sons, where it became Bolland Scenic Studios, which is what delivered Hastings. All of the style changed. There's a very different emphasis as far as the stage machinery and new technology, and the scenic art over the decades just kind of falls to the wayside. So this amazing, they were still turning out good scenery, but not as much. They began to focus on the technology. So for example, here is in Hastings, still absolutely beautiful scenic art. And what makes Hastings really remarkable and unique is that you're able to take these same designs and compare it to other collections across the country. So Hastings is on the left, Richmond is on the right, and in the January of 2022, I removed, with a very small crew, all of the scenery at the Richmond Scottish Rite and transported it to Tucson, because Rex Hutchins was able to get it and preserve it, where it's still awaiting its final fate. But we were able to thoroughly document it before it was rolled up and shipped and driven cross country. So there's that lineage to it. This gives you also an example of same scene, slightly different color palette. And then a similar design in St. Louis. And this is what you could do with the same emblems, the same objects, the same backlit elements, but on a 90-foot wide stage. And so the largest scenery for the Scottish Rite was in St. Louis, as far as the width of the stage, but then probably McAllister, Oklahoma, because those drops were 40 by 56 to 60 feet, whereas these are about 94 to 96 feet wide, and they were painted in sections. Just to give you a sense of detail, the black curtain was because of a dance recital. And that is the end of my my presentation. I'm 3 minutes over, and I will stop sharing and open the floor for questions.
Okay, everybody, Dan Deffenbaugh is going to take care of turning on or offering you an opportunity to turn your mics on so that you have questions. And at this point, I will disappear again. But thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And so while we're waiting for you to formulate questions, scenic art was intended to be viewed at a distance. So fine artists that painted small never really transitioned well to paint large scenery, because you have to paint it for at least 20 feet away. And if it's not painted for 20 feet away, so let's say you take a photograph and project it on a back wall of a realistic scene, your eye will actually blur the composition. Scenic artists were very careful about how they divided color, so the hue is set apart with warms and cools, the contrast and value is set apart, because the audience eye needs to work to give it realism to the stage. Also, with how I described how it was painted, this is not like contemporary latex paint. If you have water damage that comes down, if it's too humid, if someone brushes against it, over time the binder breaks down, so it will again dust, and that dust that comes off, it's like lead paint on a windowsill. When the dust comes off, it carries arsenic and lead and cadmium and a whole bunch of things that you don't want to inhale, as far as all of the flash powder from different degree special effects and brick mortar and pigeon guano and bat guano and you name it, that's on there too. So the idea is, as soon as the color starts going off, so you don't end up with a shroud of Turin, basically, you want to be able to have the color that sticks on, and then it's fine. But it's incredibly susceptible. You cannot touch these up with latex paint, acrylic paint. You don't want to have someone buy a bunch of dry pigment, because ultimately you can make more damage than just leaving a water stain. So these are they're high maintenance in a sense, but once that binder is reintroduced, and they can be restabilized, that loose paint can be consolidated, everything can be patched, but you have to be aware. Okay, questions?
Yes, there's two ways we can do this. You can write your question in the question and answer tab down there, or you can just turn on your mic and ask questions. And if you want, you can even turn on your camera so we can see who you are. I'm interested in the last thing that you said was there were a number of drops that were being removed from Richmond. I guess that Scottish Rite building was sold, or the organization went defunct. But who's buying these now? Are they being preserved in museums, or are they going to be sent?
So you guys probably, Omaha, paid the highest purchase rate for historic scenery in the United States so far. And that still was a fraction of what these drops are. Based on the materials and expertise, I would say your average Scottish Rite backdrop has about 25 to 40,000 replacement value. So that a replacement appraisal, meaning if you were to replicate this with the materials and the same materials, that's how much it would cost you to replicate it. Market value, the Scottish Rite shot themselves in the foot by having a couple of scenery collections in the past couple of years go at auction for nothing. So you don't want to go off of a market value. For example, Fort Scott, and I was the one who brokered that deal with the Minnesota Masonic Heritage Center. The initial offer of $2,500 was up to $25,000 for that collection. New Orleans, I think, went for $1,000, and those were just cherry picked by the Texas group that bought it. Some of the collections have gone with the building, but if anything, if a Scottish Rite flips, and we're going to find this in Tampa, or yeah, the Tampa Scottish Rite is being demolished in, I think, probably 45 days. That's a 1974 collection. What happens to that? You don't want to sell it to prove that you only get $100 for it because they're all going to flood the market at the same place. You want to document it really, really well, both front and back and details. And then you want to gift it to another valley. You don't want to charge the other valley. You want to give it to them because you want it to stay within the fraternity and not be purchased by a private citizen who's going to do even more damage to the fraternity as far as what's being used, especially when they get the hell scenes. Okay.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Mhm.
Any other questions?
I have one, John Williamson here. What impresses me, I think, is the way you can put different backdrops that are spaced different distances from the front of the stage back to create depth perception, but they all match up so well.
Well, that's because the scenic artist fully understood how painting for a distance and stage illusion goes. It wasn't just a series. I mean, there's a formula as far as where it's placed and how they fit together. And that's all figured out in the design because, okay, hold on. If you have, I happen to have my opera model for visual reference. So they would go around the country with these little models to every single Scottish Rite, and then say, okay, do you want all of this or do you want just 2 layers? So all of those custom, goes on the floor, all of those custom installations at Scottish Rite were hand selected and funded by generations of Masons. And so they figured that out in the design. There were some standard designs, John, but then it's just painted up and you're 6 feet away and it's based on a grid system. So it has to be figured out in the design and then it's just enlarged. Does that answer your question? You're muted.
Oh, yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
James, feel free to jump in. I believe you had a question as well.
Yes. My question is, when you're talking about the way the dry pigments that used really helped reflect on light, my question would have been, when the scenic artist is painting, would he try to get a, I would imagine each stage is quite different when it comes to lighting. Would they be able to account for that, or is it all they painted at their studio?
No, they accounted for it. So the way that the lighting systems worked, as electricity was being introduced, the popular combination, unlike today's lighting theory, was red, blue, and white. And so when you combine all of those colors, white gives you your intensity, but the red and the blue help that scene. When they are combined, they create an amber color, like this warm glow on stage. So you're able to go from daytime to nighttime with just those 2 lights and intensity. That's how the majority of Scottish Rite stages were delivered. So that's what they were painting for. They were painting for a light system. Why it works so well is there is no replacement for dry pigment, because even the scenic paints, so if we think of like Artist Choice or Roscoe Supersat or Iddings or Off Broadway, that pre-mix, even though it says flat, has a slight sheen to it. And it's not just color and binder, it's color, binder, and a little bit extra to preserve it and keep shelf longevity and flexibility. And it's that stuff that also interacts just a little bit with the light. So with contemporary lighting of scenery, if you have something painted by a scenic artist, now, what they always complain about is, oh, they put the wrong lights on it and it just killed the scene, because some of the colors will become dead. So if you shone like a red light on a green patch, it would be really icky. That doesn't happen with dry pigments, because the painting process, as they were working it up on the palettes that I showed, they knew that if you add in a little bit of warm and a little bit of cool, it looks good under white light, but it also helps that transition when you want to have metamorphosis on stage and a scenic effect. So current scenic art where you like mix up in the little buckets and that's the color you use for your highlights and that's the color. It was a whole different approach because you had your paint palette, and other than some colors where you'd have like acres of sky to go, you'd be mixing up as you go. So there's this constant, the way I was taught to paint is you always add in the complementary color. So the complementary color of blue is orange, of green is red, and of, yellow is purple. That deadens it and doesn't make it glow so much. It gives it more of a realistic approach. And as we start to go to the 20s, 40s, and 50s, that color theory, other than in some places, like at J.C. Backings in Hollywood, that starts to go away. And whether it's not being taught or the school of painting that people came from, you don't have that same magical glow. So what the Scottish Rite has in Hastings and Omaha is that you have the ability to make your scenes look like no contemporary scenes can look. So the versatility is remarkable, but at the same time, lighting systems, if you use the wrong contemporary lights, which happened at Hastings, you get hot spots unless they're diffused, because the idea for lighting scenic illusion is you have to have a soft general wash from above that can uniformly change color, side lights, and a little front light. A lot, not all, but a lot of contemporary lighting designers are lighting Scottish Rite stages for dimensionality, for people, and to accentuate things. They're destroying the painted illusion by doing that. You have to accommodate both worlds. Did that answer your question, James?
Oh, yes.
Probably more than you needed. Sorry.
It was one of those things that I'm the collections manager at the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, so all this stuff, art, we have some paintings and some murals from Alan Cox and so forth, so that will all your information's got to be utilized in the future.
And that's one other thing to think about, because backdrops, unlike even a huge distemper painting, they are not meant to be on a wall and uniformly lit with a set lighting thing. They are meant to be metamorphic and backlit and front lit and have a whole bunch of different effects. So when you restore them, you cannot go solely contemporary scenery restoration, but you also can't go solely art conservation methods, because those don't deal with handling. And that's actually why I've been in Belgium, is because having that communication with the art history and conservation community of this actually needs a special kind of conservation. You can't just apply standard techniques. It's different. So
I'm wondering about I presume they were men and women who painted these scenes, or was it predominantly men? And were they Masons? Were they part of Scottish Rite? And if not, what did they need to know about Scottish Rite rituals in order to paint these scenes?
Well, so the quick answer is it depended on who was supervising the painting. In the very beginning, yes, you had the Masonic connection, just like with Pettibone, where you would have someone go market their service. And it helps if you market rituals or costumes or something, if you're actually a member of the fraternity. So yes, there was always a studio owner, almost always, who was a Mason or a Knights of Pythias or Improved Order of Red Men or Odd Fellows, or, Elks, you name it, they're going to be a member. And studio owners were notorious for joining everything. They were like the joiners, because you had to know what you were designing. Now, if the design was really good, that would be awesome. And sometimes in like the 1870s to 80s, yeah, a lot of those early scenic artists were also Masons. So like David Strong, who came out of New Haven, Connecticut, that's where he was raised and went through Oriental Lodge in Chicago. He was referred to as the daddy of Masonic design at Sossman and Landis. But after he died, because he dropped dead of a heart attack and then someone else takes over, for the 18th degree, the pelican that's piercing its breast, there are pelicans all over the United States and Scottish Rite holding worms. And I'm absolutely floored. And there's a lost in translation moment. And I've written about this, where if you see this small little bird sitting on a nest, and if there aren't young around you, you might not add them in. And I think that's the case with Hastings, actually, where your 18th degree has the pelican piercing its breast, there's blood, but then there's nothing around it. And it's like pelican suicide. It loses that whole symbolism as far as why you're doing it. And so it started to go more away because there were standard designs. And so there's a little bit of variation in that. A lot of the Scottish Rite designs are just tried and true designs that were on opera. There are certain designs that are very Masonic, 18th degree peristyle throughout the Southern jurisdiction, 32nd degree, the whole nonagon thing for the camp. There's the 13th degree, and like the secret vault. That one's very Masonic, just because of the transparencies, not because of the room, but with most of them where they have the urns on. The cathedral scene that I pointed out, that could be in any theater except for the transparencies made it very Masonic. So
can you go back to the pelican? You said it looks like pelican suicide because there's nothing around it. Can you say more about that?
So the whole point of, because it's in the degree.
Sacrifice.
It's the sacrifice. It's the pelican piercing its breast to feed its young. If you have a pelican with young and a worm, I mean, what does that even mean? Pelicans don't eat worms. It means the artist didn't understand that. And they thought, oh, it's a bird sitting on a nest with a whole bunch of young. We'll just put worms in. And the same as with the pelican piercing its breast to feed its young. If there aren't young, that doesn't make sense.
What? I guess I've always thought there were young that they're
You're gonna have to,
young
I was
there.
gonna say,
In Hastings,
double check, because I am almost positive it's Hastings. It's either Hastings or Omaha, because
it is Hastings. And Dan, you're not going to be able to unsee it now.
I'm so sorry.
I know.
Always going to notice
the
that.
reason I think I see it is because you're listening to the narrative, right? And you're listening to the narrative as it's being spoken, and you're looking at the pelican, and you're right. I'm not going to be able to unsee it. And
I'm so sorry, but it's the
Wendy,
whole
come
thing
in
of
and-
like, oh, go ahead.
please come in and paint some little pelicans for us.
Happy. But it's like, if you think of the middle chamber lecture and you have all of those different elements, if a bunch of them were wrong, and it's wrong for a century and no one says anything, is there something being lost in translation for the membership? Or is that a teaching opportunity to say, it's always been this way, but by the way, this is not ionic, or by the way, this is wrong. It's something to, you can always turn it into a teachable moment. So
Right.
maybe that can feed into the self-sacrifice. And I'm so sorry, but it just, once I started realizing, and the one who is the culprit for the worms, that's Thomas Moses, who I followed, because it was, it's Fort something in Kansas. It's the one that's the military.
Fort Hayes?
No, not Fort Hayes, but I'm trying to think what the Kansas ones are. They had like 7. So it's the idea of, he was supervising, which, because the Masonic guy had died, and Sossman, who was the other big Masonic guy from the studio, was on vacation a lot by that point, it was just lost. So,
Oh boy, John Williamson has a question. He has his hand up, and I want to keep him.
okay,
Go ahead,
John,
John.
sorry.
Couple of things. You can turn my video back on. I'm back from where I went. But I noticed that one of our participants is Christian Sosman. I wonder if he is any kin to the one that you've been referring to.
Oh, Sossman?
Yes,
Sosman?
yes, is a participant here.
John, I don't know if you guys can hear me at all.
Yes,
we can hear you, Christian.
I did have family in that area, and the Sosman side at least has been in the U.S. since, what is it, 1723 or something along those lines.
Mhm.
But I'll have to do some research and get back to you on that one.
Oh, just give it a week and I'll have his entire
Oh, yeah.
biography. Because right now, I just finished writing about his wife and where his wife came from. Sossman didn't leave any descendants because he married later in life and adopted two sons as far as his wife from a previous marriage. But what's remarkable about the studio owners and a lot of the people painting Masonic scenery, that first generation, what I call the Genesis collection really, is they all fought in the Civil War. And then they all moved west. So the Midwest has been overlooked quite a bit. And I mean from like Kansas City to probably Salt Lake City, stopping at Denver for sure. The innovation in theater is mind-boggling, and it's because of the money that was funneling in, not just to Scottish Rites, but the mining money in particular. And it's very exciting because there's always this wannabe resurgence of what's happening, but the Midwest for a very long time was a theatrical center. We think of New York, well, that's a recent shift. After the fire of 1871, all of the artisans came in because there was money and a whole bunch of building. And for quite a while, until probably just after the Columbian Exposition in 1893, Chicago was the hub, and they were in the center and they were connected by all the railways. So they could easily bid out New York or California and win the bid because they could just ship it by rail, versus if you're in New York, it's a lot harder to bid with what's in California. So I find that kind of fascinating. But the Sossmans, www.drypigment.net is where I've been posting all the biographies. So Sossman starts tomorrow, and there's not an E. Okay.
I actually just started looking at that and I saw your name at the bottom of the article. I was reading through, or one of them at least. So thanks for that. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. It's a fascinating family, and they weren't trained as artists. That the group of studio owners, they knew who to hire. I mean, they were painting and they could paint, but they hired the best of the best, like the ones who were working in Philadelphia and Boston and New York and in San Francisco. It was remarkable. And Sossman just starts painting, and he's trained by a really well-known guy, and he meets his business partner in Fairfield, Iowa in 1875, and they are in the right place at the right time with the right people. I mean, he could not have been more lucky if he tried. So.
Wow.
I have a question on
Go ahead, Michael.
the construction part, and I don't know if this falls under your expertise, but for Omaha, you wrote on your blog, MC Lilly received the contract for Omaha's theater. They subcontracted in 1914 to Sossman and Landis. But you write that Hastings, the drops were produced by Volin Studios and installed in 1930, but not all of the drops were constructed for the stage. So my question is, when these guys were building the buildings, John Latenzer for Omaha and tip of my tongue, and I can't think of the architect for Hastings, he was from Des Moines. These guys aren't necessarily masons, but they know how to design a theater. How do they?
Well, and they don't necessarily know. Oh, so they don't really know. The big misnomer is that architects understood how to build stage houses, which was not the case. So unless it was an architect who started out as a scenic artist, which there are some, including Tignall Frank Cox, who did like 50 Claw and Erlanger theaters, but still did scenic art. Those designs, architects worked with scenic studios. So they'd decide kind of what scale the box was going to be. And then the scenic studios would say, and this is what needs to be in the box. This is all of the machinery and the weight and everything else. So that box was designed with that system. So if you take like a Scottish Rite stage house or any historic scenery venue, and you suddenly go, well, now we're going to have pipes and a steel grid, that's the thing that holds all the scenery, we're going to do that. Well, it's not a box that you just shove in a different thing. It would be like taking one car that uses one type of motor and just going, oh, well, we'll just throw a new motor in this car that are all different parts. It doesn't really work that way. You have to be able to look at the big picture. So they worked hand in hand. That's one thing to think about. And when I talk about the umbrella-ing of MC Lily, if you're a client and you want like a theater built, you want to have someone umbrella it. You don't want to have to provide the own project manager that finds the masons, that finds, the people who are going to paint the scenery or the lighting system. So MC Lily was very well known out of Columbus, and I'm hoping that's right. And they would get the contract for like the stage. They didn't produce scenery at all. They subcontracted to Sossman and Landis. And MC Lilly and Sossman and Landis were so close because of Bester G. Brown, who came out of Kansas City. He was the Western sales representative for MC Lilly, the Western division. And he partnered with Joe Sossman. So that would just come in, and that's how they almost all worked.
So they would have an in-studio architect at Sossman who would get with John Latenzer here in Omaha and say, this is what you need for the box part. Okay.
Right. And design the foundation around it. And very seldom did they screw up, but when they screwed up big and roofs collapsed and stuff.
That's kind of how it goes. I've noticed in life.
When you screw up big. Yeah.
Otherwise, people don't recognize it. So,
yeah.
As Martin Luther said, sin boldly, so.
Yeah, that's it. And the other thing to make a point of is Scottish Rite scenery were like cars in a sense of a valley that was growing would take their original collection and the studio would give them credit toward the purchase of new. And then that collection would end up somewhere else. And the example I use is the Little Rock scenery that was produced between like 1896 and 1901. In 1923, when Little Rock, Arkansas decided to go back in with all the Masonic orders and do their big building, that scenery was divided in half. Half of it went to Miami. The other half is still used in Pasadena, California. It was added to over the years, but all of the machinery and the scenery, or half of it, went there. So there's some of the first generation Southern jurisdiction scenery in Pasadena right now that was original to the Little Rock. I want to say if it's Scottish Rite Cathedral or when it became the Albert Pike Memorial Building, Temple Building. So, next.
Well, are there any other questions? Our time is upon us. I don't want to cut us short if people are still wanting to ask some questions here. It doesn't appear that way, but Wendy, I am completely fascinated all of a sudden. Can you remind us the name of your blog?
Oh, it's www.drypigment, DRYPIGMENT, and then .net.
It's
NET.
net. Okay, drypigment.net.
And if you do keyword search, for about 5 years, I wrote a page and a half every single day. And when I started doing like the 20-page biographies, that's when it's taking me more time. There's like a whole bunch of stuff that happened during COVID, other than me painting. But it's intended as type in Scottish Rite lighting, Scottish Rite scenery, Omaha Scottish Rite, Louisville Scottish Rite, Pepper's Ghost, 31st Degree, and all of those will pop up that you can click on. It's intended as a database. And the pictures are going to be small on some of them because I haven't been able to enlarge them yet. Switching servers and doing updates, it took some of the earlier stuff and shrunk it.
Well, given all of the narrative you've written, are you thinking about putting this into a book or?
Yeah, so here's how that worked. After the Santa Fe Scottish Rite one, I thought, well, I'm going to do a book on Thomas Moses. We've got his whole unpublished diary. When I was 19 and going through his memoirs, so he had annual diaries, and in 1933 he typed them all up. So he did this everything, and you find the good and the bad about Scottish Rite, Hollywood, everything. And I thought, I'm going to go through every single line and figure out where exactly he was working. So I started that in 2016 when I was released from the Minnesota Masonic Heritage Center, and I set up my little blog and I did my whole little thing. And as I tracked it down, and it went from 100 parts to 1,000 parts to 1,200 parts. So right now I'm at about 1925, 24, 25. I still have 10 years to go. And seriously, but I realized while I was doing this I actually have to write the book about Sossman and Landis Studio first, because they were the game changers. To put this in perspective, between 1880 and 1881, they delivered scenery to like 74 theaters. By 1894, they had delivered scenery to 4,000 theaters. By 1902, they had delivered scenery to 6,000 theaters in the United States, Mexico, Canada, the Caribbean, and South Africa. So that was their theater work. And then you figure that's who Al Ringling called to do all of his Grand Circus spectacles. That's who Frederick Thompson called to do Trip to the Moon, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. That's who some of the Marx Brothers called until Moses decided they weren't trustworthy. I mean, it's like so much that I wrote the whole history of the studio and thought, okay, this is really good. You know what? I've got 30 names of people that actually worked there. I'm going to write biographies because that'll be a nice little ending to the book. This shows the staff. Okay, well, I'm on biography number 85 because they just kept popping up. So for the past year, the majority of posts you'll see are, let's start out with 83. That's the one that's currently posted.
Yeah.
And you can go down and you can see who is who, because it's fascinating with what these people were. And some of them never made it big, but some of them were just remarkable. So that's the next book. And as my husband keeps saying, are you almost done? And I'm like, oh yeah, I've just got like 4 more biographies to go and then I'm good. So.
But their service in World War I and probably in World War II is also a story in itself.
Oh, and the camouflage painters. I didn't realize that they went, it's a Minneapolis guy that they went to Canon. And he trained in all of the scenic artists to do camouflage. He picked the Marines. They were all assigned to the different branches of the military. And then he ended up fighting the rest of his life for veterans' rights. So he still painted, but I mean, it's those side stories, or who was creating matte paintings for one of the other artists that shifted through and went to Hollywood is the one who paints the scene of Tara in Gone with the Wind when you have all the credits. That was a Sossman and Landis guy too. So Harper's Bazaar person, he was too. It's fun to see the diversity and the depth. And you had asked about women, people of color, Black people. You didn't advertise anything if you weren't white and a male. So they were painting. And you can find them in the newspapers, but they're not part of our history because they were just left out and not advertised. I've been tracking down African-American scenic artists working in the 1840s in Texas, women scenic artists that had their entire studios for panoramas, but it was under a male name. So it really is, it's fascinating, but because of research capabilities right now, you can track down a lot of that. It's not seamless. You can't like type it in and expect it's going to come up. There are ways to work on your search.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
I really have a new interest now, and I appreciate your insight. Don or Deputy Dan or Micah or anybody, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Personally, I was absolutely fascinated. Wendy, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate your sharing your wealth of knowledge with us.
You are welcome. I'm happy to come back at any time. You pick the subject. Okay. Have a really good night. Should I sign out now? Are we good?
Go ahead, Don.
We won't sign out quite yet.
Okay. I'm going. Have a good night.
Good
Thank
night.
you so much.
Thanks again, Wendy.
You're welcome.
Great work. Thanks.
The April Lyceum presentation will be given by Tom Howder, and we don't, unless Micah has come up with something recently, don't know the title. So I pulled up the 5 things that Tom had at the top of his list. Looking beyond the surface, the Masonic Obligations, parts 1 through 3, fake news and how to recognize it, 18th century education, and Masonry as a progressive science. So stay tuned. You'll find out what it is when we know. Micah, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't have anything else, but I'll talk to Tom and we'll get a topic and get the word out to everybody.
Okay.